We are just about to start. If you could please find your seats.
Velkommen tilbage. Ja, I know.
We are starting in 2 minutes, so if you please find your seats. So 1 minute to go. I need to have the Deputy Prime Minister of Moldova to find a seat so we can start. Welcome. There's over there. Welcome back from lunch, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's host, Denmark's Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen. I started this conference with a confession. I have no recollection of the European Council in June '93 because I was interrailing. You may have a better memory than me, but of course we do remember the defining moment of our generation, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But goodness, our wildest dreams were overtaken by reality. Or to paraphrase the Oxford historian Timothy Garton Ash, if a politically interested Snow White went to sleep on New Year's Day of '89 and woke up again on New Year's Eve 2009, she would have rubbed her eyes in disbelief. Countries such as Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, that did not even exist as sovereign states, were now members of the EU and NATO. So were new states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, as well as Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and a state from the former Yugoslavia, Slovenia. So I won't ask you to close your eyes, because I know with your workload that could be dangerous. But what are your dreams for Europe 2033 enlargement-wise, and what role do the Copenhagen Criteria play today? So the floor is yours. Let's give a big hand of applause.
Thank you, Løkke. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to Copenhagen. Welcome back from the lunch break. I can't recall anything from 1993. I was around 9 years old. I probably attended a scout camp or something like that. But now I'm getting old, and old enough to remember at least certain aspects. But what happened here, like 30 years ago, is from school books, so to speak. 12 European heads of state and government met here in Copenhagen, which is in itself different from today's life. The European family was quite small back then, only 12 members. But the spirits were high. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Geopolitics had changed for the better. And it was a time of hope and opportunity. The heads of state were here to formulate the criteria to be met by new family members, the so-called Copenhagen Criteria, because Europe was finally going to unite. It was not an easy task, but everybody involved made it happen. So, dear friends, today we are standing on that legacy, and we must now work together to reach new landmarks. My own daughter, she's not even 30 years old. She's too young to really remember a time when 12 states made up the entire European Union. And I guess for her, and for a lot of other young people, it is not something extraordinary that Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic states are part of our family. It's just normal business, so to speak. But 30 years ago, it was only a dream that took hard work to make come true. And today, we have new dreams for our European family. One of those who dared to dream 30 years ago was the former Danish Prime Minister, Mr. Poul Nyrup Rasmussen, who attended us, or you, this morning, but unfortunately can't be present this afternoon. But he played a role, together with some of the greatest political figures of the day, Helmut Kohl, François Mitterrand, Jacques Delors, just to name a few. They drew the roadmap for a new and larger European family. And however strange it must seem today, it was the first time that a set of criteria for becoming a member of the European Union were formulated. They were created in a time of hope and opportunity. The Cold War had just ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Freedom and independence were suddenly within reach for countries that had been suppressed for decades, countries in Central and Eastern Europe. They wanted change, progress, democracy, prosperity. They wanted to become members of our European family, and they succeeded. The candidate countries were quick to take up the challenge. The commitment to the reform process was impressive. And I remember I traveled to the Baltics just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when you visit those three countries today, I mean, it's like night and day. It's truly a dream come true. In around 10 years, the Baltic states went from forced members of the Soviet Union to be free and full members of the European Union. This is truly, truly impressive and a good example to follow. In Ukraine, I have seen the destruction and felt the pain of our heroic fighting Ukrainian friends. We can only be inspired by their courage. In Georgia, you can literally see the closeness of Russia when fences come alive at night and move through people's garden in order to expand Russian control of Georgian territory. We can only admire their resolve to be independent. And most recently, I visited Moldova with my colleagues from the Baltic states, and together we saw the hard work done by talented politicians who every day make efforts to reform their country. And to be in Moldova, with among others Markus, the Latvian foreign minister who unfortunately had to leave for a meeting in his capital later today, and with other foreign ministers of the Baltic states, people who better than everyone else know how important it is to be a part of a European family, was truly something special. While Russia's unjust invasion of Ukraine was a brutal wake-up call to some of us, for our Baltic friends, they knew all along what Russia was capable of. And that is why it is so important to hear which lessons particularly these countries can share with us, because lessons matters. And that's why I'm honored to host this conference, bringing the success story of the Baltic states together with our new French in the West Balkan and the eastern part of Europe, who should join our family as soon as possible. And right now, in these minutes, only 2 hours of flight from here, Ukraine is fighting for its survival. With the help, and I'm happy to say, of a united European Union. So, dear Ukrainians, we will continue to support you with military equipment, with support for reconstruction, with all the political support we can muster. It's probably not exactly what Putin dreamt about 1.5 years ago, that he actually managed to reunite Europe and the NATO alliance as well. And that is because your fight is vital to us all. It is a fight for freedom, for democracy, and for independence. And today, we are the ones to finish the job that Poul Nyrup Rasmussen and his colleagues around Europe started 30 years ago. We are the ones who need to embrace new family members and build a truly united Europe, a European Union open to those who wish to join, united around common values. And I am totally convinced that the Copenhagen Criteria can help us to do exactly that, because they have stood their test for 30 years, and that is no small feat. We now have a new momentum, and we should all seize this momentum. That does not make us lower the bar, though, because the criteria are there to ensure that we will still have a well-functioning European Union in another 30 years. But instead, we must help the candidate countries to be able to get over the bar. This goes for Ukraine, for Moldova and Georgia, and it goes for Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, North Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo in the Western Balkans. You should take full advantage of this moment and momentous. You have come a long way already, and we are all rooting for you to make the final sprint. The momentum also puts pressure on the existing members to prepare for new family members. I think it goes without saying, but nevertheless I think we have to say it loud so our people can hear it. It goes without saying that, say, 36 member states simply cannot function with the exact same procedure as the current EU of 27. So we need to look at how to adapt our decision-making procedures, just as we need to look at how to adapt our policies, agriculture policy, cohesion policy, and our budget, of course. This simply has to be done. And it must not stand in the way of allowing new members to join the European Union. But we need to speak loudly about it also to prepare our population to most needed changes in the future. We need to get our house in order to prepare for more members. Because, dear friends, history is calling us. Nobody must doubt that we will work hard to make our larger family come together, just like Poul Nyrup Rasmussen and his colleagues worked hard 30 years ago, and another predecessor, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and his colleague did 20 years ago when the big enlargement package was sealed in Copenhagen. That is the only way to bring lasting peace to our continent. That was the case 30 years ago, and that is the case today. And in 30 years' time, I hope that people will look back and say, well done. In 30 years' time, I hope that there will be nothing extraordinary about a larger European family. And that I hope that there will be a new generation who have not the slightest idea of what happened today, 30 years ago. I hope people 30 years from now will regard it as the normal Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech and for being the mastermind behind this important conference. I know you have a meeting now due to the dramatic events around Europe. However, by focusing so much upon Ukraine, you provide us with an excellent speech for our next speaker. But let's give a big hand of applause to the Foreign Minister of Denmark, Lars Løkke Rasmussen. And as I already alluded to, now it gives me utmost pleasure to introduce our third keynote speaker. Last time I saw you, you were only on screen. You spoke at the Annual Council of European Foreign Relations in Stockholm. While you spoke, I immediately thought about Madeleine Albright. Why? Not only because of your very, very forceful intervention, but also because I spotted a pin right behind you on your chair. And what did Madeleine Albright always say? Read my pins. And your pin at that day was fighter jets, because that's what I saw behind you. As Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, you are spearheading your country's way into the EU, and I think you have impressed us all by your country's ability in the midst of a war to fill out the long questionnaire on membership. In June, you succeeded in obtaining candidate status, and now your next aim is to receive the green light for accession negotiation. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm hand of applause to the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I would probably start with saying that this trip has been planned in advance, the only one since the beginning of the full-scale war. And this was because immediately when Ukraine has been granted a candidate status, I heard the very first thing from the Danish Prime Minister, we will be warmly welcome you in Copenhagen for the 30th anniversary of the Copenhagen Criteria. Probably I would be happy to present you some of the context as we see things from Kiev, from a center of Europe, a country in war. 73 years ago, Europe willing to recover from war and bring back itself to life has been united with the European community to make sure that in a coordinated and united efforts, Europe will revive and stay united. 30 years ago, value-based approach has been enshrined in the Copenhagen Criteria, saying that the values should unite nations. Values should be the criteria for becoming a member. And now, 9 years ago, and 490 days ago, we understand that values is something that you not only have to preserve and cherish, values is something that you have to fight for. And now standing here, having so much experience in coordinating our efforts in terms of military support, engaging with many leaders, prime ministers, ministers, organizations around the globe, I can give you a solid confirmation that EU withstood a test. Nobody would imagine that on 24th of May, calling to the European Commission, I hear, Olga, all people willing to save themselves from the war are open to join and come to European Union. Nobody would imagine that. Nobody would imagine that it is European Union which has been established to prevent the hunger for any aggression would start supporting a country beyond EU borders with the military support. And nobody would imagine that, again, after 33 years, EU would have to mobilize another 50 billion euros to recover a biggest country in Europe after the war. So here we are, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Copenhagen Criteria, knowing that we have to fight for them. And I think that this fight is now taking place not only in a battlefield in Ukraine. This is the fight we have been there for 490 days in everyday decisions and solutions we have been taking, relying on our feelings, relying on our leadership, relying on the sentiment of every citizen of European Union rising the Ukrainian flag since 21st of February. I have never seen so many flags of Ukraine, even in Ukraine. And this has been deeply, deeply in our heart because we knew that we have the same feeling and you are standing with us. It's really important. I have a huge and long list of reforms we managed to accomplish over this year since we become a candidate country. We had a very warm and nice exchange with our colleagues from Moldova on this track record. And now when we're talking about accession talks or steps joining the European Union, I think that the major important thing for us that we're doing it for Ukrainians. I've been spending the whole day yesterday in Brussels, and it was very pleasant to me to inform that the recent information and updates from the global arena I receive from the front line, from our armed forces. And every minister or prime minister I'm meeting, I always say that a soldier in Zaporizhia is monitoring what you're doing, is assessing the decisions you're taking. And this is a special burden of responsibility for the historic decisions we're taking right now. That's why the commitment of Ukrainians is for us, for Ukrainians. It has been an enormous moral boost to hear shortly after the beginning of the full-scale invasion that all 27 leaders said, Ukraine, we are with you. No matter what, as long as it takes, and when the war is over, you become part of the European Union. Let's bring ourselves back in that times. It wasn't clear. We didn't know whether this support will be united, whether everything will be coordinated, whether military support will be there. Nothing was clear. It wasn't even clear what is the end of war would look like. When would that happen? So hearing a solid yes, a solid and strong unity of support, it was a historical decision, and it brought us to where we are. We decided that basically the fast-track accession to European Union would be the speed that Ukraine will ensure in terms of its transformations and reforms. And that's what we are doing right now. And I'm really happy to say that not all of us politicians in Ukraine are standing with their guns on the front line or fighting on the battlefield. But politics are our mandates, are our ammunition and our armor. And I can assure you that we used it to full coordination of Parliament, of the government, and of the President. And here we are feeling proud that we have not let down your trust. And ending my short intervention, I want to say that it is not yet time to make the conclusions, to learn the lessons. There are so many more decisions to be taken. There is so much more leadership is required to win the war, to restore justice, and to stay united, and to enshrine in our daily job the very fact that the values is something that we have to fight for. So let's stay tuned, and Slava Ukraini, and together to the victory.
Thank you for your very strong speech. I'm sure that Madeleine Albright is looking down at you right now and also cheering for you. I think we actually have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if you just go back there, because we need you up there. 419 days, you said. I know it's a bit sort of to speculate, and you also said the conclusion has not been written, but if you sort of look upon your development in Ukraine, what is your sort of timeline with regards to accession of the European Union?
Definitely we are ready to start the accession talks, and I think it's not already not a political question, because again we're talking about the recovery and rebuilding Ukraine, and it should be based on the principles and understanding that we're doing it as future member of European Union. So it's basically the essential necessity to start the accession talks and align the reforms with the reconstruction efforts, especially now when just a week ago European Commission has announced a huge financial package for 4 years in the amount of 50 billions, and this could be only the beginning of this massive financial mobilization for the recovery, for this Marshall Plan for Ukraine, the US, the other G7 group to join. So basically it's vital to start the accession talk, to keep focused and structured in terms of reforms and conditionalities. On the accession itself, it would depend on many factors. And it would depend on a broader enlargement framework and a discussion within European Union. It would depend on the reform of the EU itself. But we are driven by our speed and commitment, and we are absolutely confident that Ukraine will not be a hostage of political ambiguity. It's not the EU who will let us down by unwillingness to take the decision. I understand that, and I have this strong feeling. So the moment when there will be a feeling that we can sign the accession agreement after the negotiations are held, it will be done immediately.
And public opinion in Ukraine, if suddenly there will be postponement of opening accession negotiations, what would the reaction be?
At this moment, we have 91% of people supporting European integration, and the army of southern activists and representatives of various think tanks moving and advocating this process forward. And basically, the major, marketing strategy for the European project as such is the reforms we managed to accomplish. So we launched a huge reform of the public finance management and of decentralization, when regions at the very local level has received the sovereignty in terms of managing their fines, in terms of development. There's been a lot of trans-border projects. So the very drive of reforms drives the public opinion, because they see it is visible and it is clear, and the principles are becoming equal for everybody throughout the country.
And which one of the most sort of, if you look upon the Copenhagen Criteria that we're debating here today, which of those, bless you, which one of the Copenhagen Criteria is the most difficult for Ukraine?
It's kind of complicated thing to answer, I guess. There is a criteria which is not difficult to implement in terms of measures to be taken, but it's difficult to prove that it's actually taking place. It's fight against corruption and the rule of law. So we have, and by the way, Denmark is the major contributor in terms of the assistance on fight against corruption. So literally being a country with the most independent and sophisticated anti-corruption institutions, with all public registers and data open, with all the documents and all the public administration within the app in my iPhone. I don't reach any of the officials. Without all transparent procurement procedures, we're still struggling to prove that we are transparent and committed, because we have a legacy, we have a leverage, we have let's say part of the bad track record, and it takes years and decades of being sainter than the Pope to show that you are committed. And as they say in NATO, there is an old strategy that to become a member of NATO, you should change 3 presidents. And if 3 presidents confirm that you are still committed to become a member of NATO, then allies might think about that. I think that in terms of this anti-corruption indicators, we have done a lot, but still we're not yet there to make sure that we are really committed.
And final question, and you mentioned NATO, the Vilnius summit is coming up. What's your expectations for that?
There are many things which have been done to have a very substantial summit, and we really feel a strong commitment of NATO, and having this background of preparing Ukraine for a couple of NATO summits over the last 5 years. This is the first time I feel the atmosphere is really different. We are heard, we've been discussed with. There will be a very strong political signal in terms of membership. There is a real consensus for Ukraine to join NATO. There is a critical political will to announce that over the summit. But for us, it's really important that we learn lessons from the past, and we do not subject ourselves to dependence for the political momentum or politicians taking the decision. We need to start the actual process to make sure that the next day after Vilnius, I can come to Brussels and I have things to discuss. So we would expect that over the Vilnius summit, we could hear the political invitation to join NATO and to start the process of identifying the modalities given the current security situation, but also given the reforms and transformation we still need to accomplish. So please, everybody who can make any impetus for this decision to be happen, please do.
Thank you very much.
You.
And as I'm sure you know, we all wish you the best of luck, and I'm actually coming to Kiev next week. Not that I think that will change anything, but I will obviously become much wiser on what is actually going on, because as the foreign minister alluded to earlier, it's only when you see the atrocities that you truly understand the importance of, you spoke about, EU membership and also NATO membership. And without further ado, we move on to our fourth keynote speaker. So buckle your seats for another mental journey to yet another candidate country, Moldova. And I'm looking for Nico. Where are you, Nico? You're over here. And you are Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Integration, Deputy Prime Minister. And it makes no sense to hide the fact that I'm especially glad to see you here in Copenhagen, because you used to work for the European Council of Foreign Relations. And I hope to see you back soon, because then Moldova will become member of the European Union. Nico, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lika. Yes, it does work. So it's really a great pleasure to be here and to meet. We just met 2 weeks ago with you, and we've all gone online in Stockholm, and it's really a great pleasure and honor to be here and to see so many friends. As many of you might know, I tended to speak on a larger spectrum of countries and issues than I will do today. Today I will stay more focused on one specific country which I am representing today. And of course, looking at the last 30 years since the Copenhagen Criteria were launched, I think before we go into the nuts and bolts of how countries consolidate their democracies and how crucial and useful the Copenhagen Criteria have been to structure the EU enlargement process, I also think it's really important to start by saying that the Copenhagen Criteria can be implemented and will in the future be in a position to be implemented by other countries only when we have peace. So a key and unspoken part of the Copenhagen Criteria is the basic military security of the countries implementing them and moving towards the EU. And as you know, going through the most dramatic large-scale military war on European soil since Second World War, it's really good to go into the nuts and bolts of the EU accession process and the EU enlargement process and the recommendations. But always before we need to do that, it's of crucial and fundamental importance to have peace return on our continent by supporting Ukraine to the end, to the victory of Ukraine, and that creates the space for Europe to be peaceful, integrated, and then for all of us to have a detailed conversation about the rest, reforms, democracy, etc. From a Moldovan standpoint, the Copenhagen Criteria have been kind of part and parcel of Moldova's transition process for the last 30 years. I think what makes a certain difference between the countries which were candidates in the 90s, and here of course I speak about Central Europe mostly, and Ukraine, Moldova, North Macedonia, Serbia, Albania today, is that all of our countries already have a much longer track record of having pluralistic democracies. We all had our fair share of problems in our transition, but we already have 30 years of experience of democracy, 30 years of experience of often imperfect, but nonetheless market economies. So to a large degree, we are of course not at the same place where Central Europe was in 93 or in 97 or even in 2000. We have done a lot in the last 30 years to consolidate our democracies, to integrate ourselves with Europe and the European market and the single market and the European economy, etc., etc. So I think all of our countries, I hope none of you gets offended, my friends and colleagues here, are quite advanced in meeting a large part of this criteria. And of course, looking back historically, I kind of just did a slight recount, and I kind of want to highlight that countries like Spain and Portugal, for example, joined the EU 11 or 12 years after the end of dictatorship. So we do have more than 30 years of transition, of proven track record of democratic change, and really, I think, to a large degree, we, as on behalf of the candidate countries, if you allow me, do have a serious track record. And then it varies individually. In the case of Moldova, we've also been very active, but the same again applies not just to Moldova as a candidate country. We've been also very active in integrating in a lot of the practical aspects of the integrated Europe. And here, there's a long list, but of course we and Ukraine and Georgia have deep and comprehensive free trade areas, association agreements, and we have implemented large parts of the acquis. And on the acquis implementation, of course, we are to a degree more advanced than many of the candidate countries were, in 95 or 97 or 99. We've all been working together and integrating together in the transport community with the EU, in the energy community. And with Olga back at lunch, we were going through those dramatic days when the war and Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine started. But actually, one of the things that happened around those days was also the fact that Moldova and Ukraine connected to the European electricity grid, the ENTSO-E system, which actually in time allowed both of us to have a much higher degree of resilience after Russia's brutal bombing of the Ukrainian energy infrastructure, because we at least physically and technically could get electricity when we needed to from the EU market. And something like that would not have been possible as of 19th of February 2022, because technically we weren't able to bring in electricity from the EU market, and after that we are. So on a lot of these things, we are very integrated already in the European economy. And here, of course, I kind of, between the lines, I refer to the market integration aspects of the Copenhagen Criteria. Also, in the case of Moldova, we've been really also very integrated into the single market. Some 2/3 of our exports before the war were going to the EU, and now that number has increased dramatically. So on a lot of things, we consider ourselves as, we of course in the last 30 years wasted quite a number of opportunities, but nonetheless a lot of systemic steps to anchor Moldova's place in the European political family, in the European economy and market have been taken. As we speak today and looking ahead, a year ago Moldova became a candidate country on the same day as Ukraine, and that of course gives us a significant light at the end of the tunnel. And as we look ahead, we have a whole set of recommendations from the European Commission. Of course, we need to implement the acquis, and we are all very busy working on that, and by being very busy, it does mean very busy. Just in April, we sent 856 pages of the Moldovan contribution to the European Commission's October enlargement report. Then in just last week, we sent our update on the April contribution, another 150 pages or so. So we have been doing that. Just yesterday, I was at the General Affairs Council in Luxembourg, where we went into the details and the nuts and bolts of what Moldova does. And we've been doing that in the face of really managing a good dozen of pretty dramatic crises. Of course, in the context of the war, everyone faces a significantly deteriorated security situation, and that of course affects Moldova. Last year we had a major humanitarian and refugee crisis. We've had a gas supply crisis. We had an electricity supply crisis. We had inflation 32%. The GDP went down 7%. We had several instances of Russian missiles crossing our airspace, posing all kinds of new risks and shattering the economic confidence of investors, of airlines, etc., etc. So, of course, we've been under a constant hybrid attack, set of cyber attacks, Russian attempts to destabilize domestic politics, to provoke violence, to take over public buildings, to stage a coup d'etat, to bring basically instability on Moldovan soil, etc., etc. So we really have a very long list, and presumably most of you also know some of the things. But the truth is that we managed to withstand all of these crises. We have managed to keep our psychological focus and administrative focus on doing all the quote-unquote boring things that candidate countries need to do, like writing reports, like doing PowerPoints, like pushing ahead with the anti-corruption agenda, with the justice system reform, with, you know, developing a slightly more developed fishery policies, so that as a future EU member state we can negotiate in a well-informed manner with countries which are not in the EU but have high stakes in how they negotiate on fisheries. So we've really been doing that by hiring more people, by trying to pay them better, by setting up 35 working groups. Also, this last winter was the first winter in our country where we have not used any Russian gas for heating. We used some for electricity generation. We have managed to stabilize the electricity situation, etc., etc. Looking ahead, we're really focused and determined to continue on meeting the Copenhagen criteria, to continue meeting the European Commission recommendations. We've fulfilled 3 out of 9. We have good progress. And towards the end, I'll tell you 2 more things, and that will be reasonably quick. And then we can only do that in the future if Ukraine stays strong, if Ukraine can liberate its territories. Ukraine is the reason that Moldova has the luxury to be peaceful and to work on political and economic reforms. And that is why the most important thing from a Moldovan standpoint, not only, of course, from a Ukrainian, is to continue helping Ukraine as much as you can do to bring peace back on the European continent. And within this framework, we can focus on the details of the Copenhagen criteria, of the EU accession process, of the much hoped from our perspective work on accelerating EU enlargement, making the EU fit for 35, and I think Daniela is in the room here, so I don't have my glasses, but all of that work we're really following very closely. With this in mind, I look optimistically at our capacity to do that. Ukraine, again, has proven that Ukraine is strong. Moldova has proven we are strong, and we are strong because we are not alone. And looking ahead, I'm sure that through the same methodology that we've been making progress on a stronger European family of nations, based on the same criteria of democracy, of rule of law, of market integration, which you can call the Copenhagen criteria, and that the next anniversary of the Copenhagen criteria, which we should organize in less than 10 years from now. I hope we will all be celebrating not just the Copenhagen criteria, but this enlarged European Union that will include our countries. Because even if you look at the previous enlargements, we've already proven, and we have an established track record of responsible members of the European family, that by us joining the EU will make Europe stronger on a global scale, on a regional scale, and on a national scale. Thank you.
Believe it or not, we have 3 minutes left, so you cannot escape. Although, etc., 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 you have a lot on your plate, maybe not fishery policy. But you have been very active recently, because you have not only sort of spent time on Moldova, you've actually also spearheaded the European Political Community Summit, I should say. Just say, I mean, did that live up to your expectations, and what role could the EPC play in the future?
So I think the EPC fills in a really important need in the strategic conversation in the EU, and very often, of course, inside the European Union, member countries meet at the European Council, and there's a regular strategic conversation. But the EU is just 27 countries, and in the EPC you have another 20 countries. Some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are on track to joining the EU, some of them have exited the EU, but we all, within the EPC at 47, have a key interest in talking together and trying to have a conversation about strategic stability of the continent and many other concrete projects. So in this sense, this was a there is a complete need for such a conversation. That conversation took place very well. From a Moldovan standpoint, we also get several other benefits, which will, we got a roaming agreement with the EU, and that's been something which would not have happened without the summit, and it's been something which we tried to get for over a decade. We managed to launch a EU partnership mission and many other bilateral initiatives that we launched. So that was really good. But perhaps the most important thing was that diplomatically, for a lot of the countries across Europe, mostly in the EU, but not only, who have never been to Moldova, neither the leaders nor the teams, I think in a lot of their minds, almost throughout that day, you could see how mentally Moldova was taken from a kind of someplace in the east and mentally put on the mental map of Central Europe, as many countries understood and realized and saw on the ground that, yeah, you have to twist a few things here and there, you have to fine-tune a few things, but there's no fundamental difference between a country like Moldova and the countries of Central Europe which have joined the EU, or the countries of the Western Balkans which have been candidate countries for quite some time, and that fundamentally Moldova's place is exactly in the EU, just as that of those other countries, which, as I said, was not necessarily obvious for a lot of the people who that morning or the day before started traveling to Moldova.
Nico Popescu, thank you very much for coming. And we continue with our panel 4. From Eastern Partnership to coming EU members. And here my panel is just about to come up here. We have with us Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Georgia. And we have Piotr Buras from the European Council on Foreign Relations, where you head the Warsaw office. Minister, a warm welcome. Your country has not yet obtained EU candidate status, but you've been given a so-called European perspective, and EU candidacy seems within reach. But how do you look upon the months ahead? And in a Danish context, I would like to add, it is especially nice to see you here, because as you know, Denmark has just opened an embassy in Georgia. So over to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, now it works.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to express my gratitude, and I'm really privileged to be here as part of this really important gathering and conference, and of course with distinguished participants in it. And we are really grateful that Georgia is permanently on the agenda, and permanently our discussions around at this critical really moment which we have now at our continent, in our region. And I do hope that we are going to be on the agenda, and we are going to be reflected in the future and the policy of European Union. And of course, when we are talking about the Copenhagen Criteria, so of course we have to be as well as we have done already, our homework reflected in the future plans of European Union. I know that it's quite difficult, but what we have now and what we have to adopt to the new geopolitical situation in Europe, it's really necessity now at this moment. And I think that the decisions, for example, which have been taken in 2004, I think it's a high time for such a decision, for such a merit-based enlargement process at the European continent. And I think that European Union will and should maintain the strategic which is an autonomous decision process, and of course the powerful role as a global player, not only on our continent but as a global actor in the world. we got last year European perspective, which is unprecedented and a really important decision from our European partners. For this, we were struggling for quite a long time. And unfortunately, what has happening in Ukraine, gave us the chance, as Foreign Minister of Moldova already mentioned, that it is an opportunity for us. And unfortunately, what is happening now, the aggression, Russian aggression in Ukraine, somehow powered the decision which we had last year. And I can assure you that would it be the last year or the years before, as we have signed the association agreement, we are devoted to the process and we are committed to the process, which is a European integration. And we are taking this commitment with real responsibilities. Just recently, we got the verbal report of 22nd of June regarding the implementation of the obligations which we have taken under the 12 recommendations, and not only 12 recommendations, because the 12 recommendations are the part of the process, and we have the association agreement, what I've mentioned already, and we are implementing, and more than 50% of the association agreement, it's not our assessment, of course, it's an assessment of the Brussels-based institutions. Georgia has implemented much more we have done when we are talking about the UAKI and when we are talking about the implementation of the DCFTA. And we understand that the more efforts are needed just to implement more obligations and more in more responsible way. And expectations regarding the decisions, of course, regarding Georgia are aside, as the expectations of our population to be the part of European Union, because this is a moment when we need to take proper decisions regarding the Georgia's candidacy status and regarding the process to start negotiations with European Union on membership. And it's not only the government who is struggling, and not only the parliament, for example, who is responsible for implementation some concrete legislative obligations within the 12 recommendations, but it's a Georgian population which fully supports EU integration, and to this moment 90% of the Georgian population supports EU integration process, and I do hope that the Georgia till the end of this year will be granted candidacy status, and we will continue with a more effective and energetic manner to implement our reform. It was mentioned in a previous panel that it is important to have concrete messages, concrete endeavors, because when we are delivering, we need some reaction as well, and we need just some more power to implement more reforms and to implement more obligations in the nearest future. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you live completely up to the Copenhagen criteria of being on time, so thank you very much for that, and also for obviously also what you said in such a short time. Well, our next speaker, we go back to the European Council of Foreign Relations, one of its sharpest minds. Whenever I'm confused about Poland, I call Piotr, or we meet in Warsaw, or we meet next to your summer house in Brandenburg. And your country has gone through the transformation process, but has also suffered some setbacks. We'll get back to that during the Q&A session. Here I'd rather ask you, how do you actually look upon the EU's present enlargement process? Because let's face it, we already heard about that, there could be some expectation management, because sometimes things take a bit longer in the EU than one would hope for. I actually remember when I came to Poland during the late 90s, there was a sinister joke, you probably remember it. The Polish president phones up God and asks, when can Poland become a member of the European Union? And God answers, not while you're in power. Then the Bulgarian president decides to phone up God, better to be on the safe side. Dear God, when can Bulgaria become member of the EU? And God answers, not while I'm in power. So it was a sinister joke, but I think the point should be clear. We also need some expectation management, but let's hear what your sort of point of view is on the upcoming enlargement process. Floor is yours.
waiting for the red.
The red
Now
light
it's working.
district.
No, no, it's working already. Yeah, thank you very much, Luca, and thank you very much for inviting me here. And it's a great pleasure, an honor to be participating at this conference. Let me say just a few words about, indeed, enlargement policy and the prospects for enlargement, because I think I have coming from Poland, from a country which is very much in favor of the next round of enlargement and supporting Ukraine and other countries on their path to the European Union. I have the feeling that this discussion which we are having at the moment in the European Union is not always focusing on the right. Not only focusing on the right issues. I think what I mean by that, we have these two debates. The one on how the EU candidate countries should prepare themselves for the accession, and this is of course the focus of the Brussels agenda, and as we have seen or heard from Niku, from Olga Stefanishina, the countries, and also, of course, in the previous panel of representatives of the Balkan countries, we have a lot of progress in many countries. A lot to be done. It's still a lot to be done in the next years. But I think, for understandable reasons, we focus on this part of the debate. We have also the debate in the European Union on the absorption capacity, which is just starting. But here is where I miss something which has been already addressed in the opening panel. We have a lot of discussion about the institutional adjustments with the EU institutional setup, the qualified majority voting, the setup of the Commission, of the European Parliament, how to adjust the internal EU procedures. But what I'm missing is a stronger interest and focus in and on the policy side of the enlargement policy, and especially the budgetary issues, agriculture, and cohesion policy. And because I was invited here to talk about the Polish experience, and
something happened to the phone.
Something's
Not the
happening
phone,
here with
microphone.
the.
It should work.
What again?
Try again.
No?
Now it works.
It's working.
She
Okay.
claims, yeah.
Yeah. And I think I would like to remind you of something which was very important in the enlargement, this round of enlargement which Poland participated in, and that was the Berlin Agenda 2000. That was a very comprehensive plan of how to adjust the EU budget, how to adjust the agricultural policy, structural funds, in the preparation for this very important round of enlargement. That was this agenda 2000 was agreed upon already in '97, and Poland and other countries joined the EU in the year 2004. And if we think about the current enlargement discussion, and we think of perhaps enlarging the European Union in the year 2030, maybe it sounds ambitious, but certainly many countries, many candidate countries think of this date, and many member states of the EU share this hope that it will be possible. So basically, you would have to start seriously thinking about that already now. And so basically, how to reform our agricultural policy, how to shape the future of the EU finances, how to perhaps adjust our structural policies, and some others. And I think that I'm saying that because we are now in the middle of the current multi-annual financial framework. We will have a new budget starting 2028, And so the next enlargement round would have to happen basically during the next multi-annual financial framework. And the question is, are we going to be prepared for that or not? And I think this is something which definitely deserves much more attention. And I would argue that after the new commission is in place, and when Poland and Denmark have or hold their respective EU presidencies in the year 2025, we would need to have something in place or agreed upon which would resemble this Berlin Agenda 2000, which paved the way for the enlargement back then. So I would finish on saying that I hope that we will have a Warsaw Agenda 2025.
Or Copenhagen Agenda.
But if we fail, so the only hope will be with Denmark, and I would hope for a Copenhagen Agenda 2025.
So from Copenhagen to Copenhagen and back to Copenhagen was your point, I guess. Thank you very much. We do have time for questions. We have 15 minutes left, so yes, there's one down there. But obviously I have to ask you, Piotr, about rule of law and about the Copenhagen Criteria, and then you become member, and then something happens. Should one have created a different process? We heard earlier that had not been possible because one would not have thought that this would happen. So think about that while I give the floor here to gentlemen. Please state your name and affiliation.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Mehmet Bulut. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission and the Charge of Affairs ad interim of the Embassy of the Republic of Turkey. My question is not to the esteemed speakers. I address my question to the organizers of this conference. Turkey is also a member. Turkey is also a candidate to the EU. All candidates, but Turkey were invited to this conference as speakers. I would like to know why was Turkey not invited as a speaker to this conference? It's very open to interpret as a double standard. I think my question will not remain irrelevant at this session with the view that Turkey is also located somehow east of the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for making that statement. I guess it should be the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that should answer that question. But I think the core argument here was that there's no negotiations taking place at the moment with Turkey. But thank you for making that intervention and reminding us that Turkey is also an accession country, and that is an important point to make. Any others before I give the floor to Piotr on rule of law? Piotr, then rule of law. The Copenhagen Criteria is to manage that strange microphone, yeah?
I think I learned how to operate. Yes, I think, you know, Poland is an example of a huge success when it comes to enlargement policy, but it's also unfortunately an example of a failure. Maybe not a complete failure, but of something which should be a warning to all accession countries that democratization and Europeanization are not irreversible. And this is a powerful warning, I think, because even in preparation for this meeting, I read a long article under the title "Democratic Dividend," written by eminent Polish scholar Wojciech Sadurski, who claimed in that paper that basically democratic backsliding in the European Union would not be possible. And I think that was, the piece was written in 2004. And I think he clearly has proven wrong. But I think what is important, I think, is to draw a certain lesson from that. And the lesson is not that the Copenhagen criteria should be rewritten, or because, of course, no criteria can, and this is the lesson that no criteria, no nothing, no treaties or agreements can prevent societies or countries from democratic backsliding. But rather, what I would put my emphasis on is a different lesson, and this is that we should, because in this accession process we focus very much on state institutions. So basically on how to make sure that democratic processes work, that the public prosecution is independent, that the state institutions functioned well, and so on and so forth. But I think the Polish lesson is that you cannot be sure that it will work forever, and that basically there is no guarantee. And if there is a political will, if there's political determination, these checks and balances can be quite easily actually violated. So I think what is extremely important that in this democratization process we put emphasis also, or even more so, on a broader definition of democratic institutions. And this is what I mean by free media, civil society, political education and integrity of public servants, also journalists, but also decentralization, for example, regionalization. Because in the Polish case, if you look at what has happened over the last 8 years, in Poland, you have had a very strong assault on democratic, basically, institutions and liberal democratic standards, but you have also had a very strong opposition to that from the civil society, from free media, from regional authorities. And you have had also in the judiciary, among the judges, a number of very courageous people with a very strong integrity. And I would bet that without them, without having this kind of checks and balances beyond the state institutions, we would be today in a completely different place. And we are not in a very good place, but we are still not a hopeless case. And I think this is actually just an opposite. We are the situation in Poland is still absolutely open, but I think it is very important to understand where it comes from. So my warning, but also my encouragement would be to all of countries and governments preparing themselves for the EU accession is to take care not only of what is really required, demanded by the EU in this quite narrow realm of acquis and reforms of state institutions, but also to invest when you have time, when you have still the opportunity to invest in all these other pillars of liberal democratic society, because this is the best guarantee that this democratic backsliding will not proceed quickly if or when it was to happen.
And I saw that Minister was taking notes. So maybe you have a response to that, but also if you could answer the following. I mean, which one of the Copenhagen criteria would be the biggest hurdle for Georgia? And then I'm still, yes, we have one. Oh, goodness now. Yeah. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's the Copenhagen Criteria and the job which we are following and the process which we are implementing now. It's a quite new for Georgia, because the decision what I have mentioned regarding the European membership was taken last year. So in fact, we were planning to apply for the EU membership in 2024, according to our national agenda. And the situation which we have in Georgia regarding the EU process, EU integration process, it's not only the process which we are just following some program and what we are going to do regarding the legislation, regarding the concrete regulations which we are going to adopt in the country, but we have quite difficult situation within the country, because we have our occupied territories, and we have the huge Russian influence now in Georgia when it's related to occupied territories, and the Russian military presence as well in Georgia. And notwithstanding the fact that during the last 3 decades, as Copenhagen Criteria have been introduced, we had 3 wars with Russia. And we have the huge responsibility when we are talking about the internally displaced persons. So more than 500 internally displaced persons we have now within the country, 500,000 within the country. And we have everyday pressure from Russia, would it be the Russian military presence in occupied territories. And I can inform you that notwithstanding the war in Ukraine and the lack of military forces in Ukraine for Russia, they are keeping still starting from 6,000 to 7,000 Russian soldiers in both regions. Previously they had 12,000, nowadays they have 7,000. And they have the heavy military equipment. That's heavy military equipment, I mean the rockets which can reach not only Georgian capital but every place in the region. And every day we are experiencing not only the military pressure but the hybrid pressure from Russian Federation, as well as when we are talking about influence, we have the huge influence, would it be the media or would it be the, some political developments and forces within the country. There is a huge influence, but we are somehow struggling, and we are somehow overcoming these difficulties. And I think that what we have reached during this last period, what we have reached regarding the development of the small country, which is devoted to the European process already for decades, and never before, notwithstanding what I have mentioned, the war with Russia, the huge influence from Russia, we never changed our foreign policy directions, which are European integration, which is a NATO integration. Even more, we have incorporated these foreign policy directions in our constitution. Now our constitution says that every and each government which comes, every power which comes to Georgia should implement the policy which is directed toward European Union and NATO integration, which is really important and which we are following. And I mentioned already in my intervention that we have a really strong base, legal base, which is the association agreement, which is the DCFTA. And I think that it gives us a really strong impetus to implement more within the enlargement package. We have delivered our report within the enlargement package, and the last one addition was as Moldova and Ukraine as well have done this month. And I think that the assessment which we have done, the job which we have done, will be really taken and properly taken, and the job done which we have already implemented will be properly assessed. One more issue which I wanted just to attract your attention is Georgia's role at this moment as a transit country and as a country which plays really important role and player when we are talking about the east-west connectivity. And just recently, so we had quite an important development when we had elaborated with European Union as a flagship initiative, so-called flagship initiatives, but it's a strategic projects which are connecting European Union with Georgia and from Georgia to the wider region. And I'm talking about the connectivity when electricity cable project, it should be implemented on the Black Sea and connecting Georgia with Romania, and when ferry connection at that time should be established. And yesterday was the first really good information that the 2 Georgian companies already started to operate between the Georgian Poti port and Romanian Constanța port. And it gives really huge opportunity not only to our region but to the wider region, to the Central Asian region as well, to be connected with European Union. And it's a huge responsibility for us just to keep our region, to keep our country safe, and to give other countries, other businesses to use this. And I'm really glad as well when we are talking about the regional dimension, when we are talking about the cooperation, inter-regional cooperation, that I'm really glad that we have refreshed our cooperation, Georgia's, and I do hope that in the future it will be within the trio as well. That we have activated work with our Western Balkan partners. So, and before war in Ukraine, so we initiated the process, but unfortunately this process, we could not start this process till the summer of the last year. And from the summer of the last year, so we managed to cut quite many things on these directions. And just in December of the last year, we hosted political directors from the Western Balkan countries in Georgia. We discussed many points. I hosted the Minister for EU integration of Montenegro to Georgia, and we are going to continue in this manner, on this direction as well. And this year I do hope that somehow we will have much more higher representation of these countries, and we trio countries, Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, managed to establish more direct contacts with the Western Balkan countries when we are talking about the EU integration process.
Thank you also for highlighting the cooperation between the West Balkans and your country. I allow for one final question, and a shorter answer, not only depending what the question is, but...
Thank you. I'm Vibe Termansen. I'm a historian and journalist of Central Europe. Thanks a lot for your analysis, Pan Buras. My question is, what now? So you're right about vivid civil society in Poland, you're right about courageous judges, you're right about press freedom still, but you have an election coming up. So what to do now in order to protect the Copenhagen Criteria and protect the values inside the European Union?
Woo! In 3 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, we've been in this process for 8 years now. So it's not a new question because...
Can you hear? Is it on?
I think it's on.
Perfect.
It is. But
just wanted to make sure that they can all hear your answer to what now. Yeah.
And so I think, we have election this year, and the fact that the situation is fairly open politically in Poland is to a large extent, or to a massive extent, because of the resilience within the Polish society, which I referred to, but it's also because of the new instruments the EU has developed over the last few years dealing with the Polish case. So the infringement procedures, the verdicts of the Court of Justice of the European Union, also the conditionality, financial conditionality, rule of law conditionality of the EU funds, all that taken together has also had an impact. And of course, these are very lengthy processes, and the EU is not in a position, and that needs to be clear, that it's not in a position to, and shouldn't be actually, to change the course of events in the EU member states. But it's with the instruments it has at its disposal to basically secure the, especially protection of the rule of law in the EU member states, can be very helpful and can slow down certain processes. And this is what has happened in Poland. But of course, I think what is very important in the next few years, and probably under the new Commission and the European Parliament, is that the system of rule of law protection in the European Union, which, as I said, has been developed over the last few years, that is consolidated and also endorsed by the EU member states, much in a more explicit and stronger way than it has been the case so far. And this is very much about the role of the Court of Justice of the European Union as the ultimate arbiter in all these issues, because we need to have an ultimate arbiter when it comes to the fundamental question. For example, do we have independent judiciary in the EU member states or not? I mean, if we cannot agree, if we cannot have someone, an institution, which is entitled to give the verdict on that, then we are lost in a rule of law based system. So I think politically it is important that the EU member states stand firmly behind the ECJ, the Court of Justice of the European Union, as the key institution, because otherwise it will be very difficult to find a different model of the protection of the rule of law in the EU. I'm saying the rule of law because in the end the rule of law is of course a narrower term than democracy, but without the rule of law we basically cannot function as the European Union. So this is the core which needs to be protected at any price, and I think this is for me the way ahead.
Thank you very much for clarifying that as well, and answering the what now question in a very sort of precise but also fast manner, because now we have coffee, but let's give our panel a big hand of applause. And we are starting again at 4 o'clock for our 5th keynote, and this time it is the founder of the Brussels Institute of Geopolitics, Luc van Middelmar. So we're looking very much forward to that, but now it's coffee time. Well done. Good. We are just about to start with our final keynote speaker and our panel. I'm looking for Luke. Where are you? Oops. He's probably just about to get some air. He was here just for... Oh, is that him? Yeah, there you are. Good. Excellent. Well, session 3 is actually more about us, so to speak. I mean, the present European Union, and not so much about what we spoke about so far, which has more been sort of the candidate countries. So now we are moving sort of to the EU as such. I'm pleased to introduce our final keynote speaker of the day, Luc van Middelaar, historian, political philosopher, founder of the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics, which was launched by, what did you say? It was Olaf Scholz, it was Macron, or you can continue this yourself. Not Helmut Kohl, although we touched upon him several times. You've been member of the cabinet of Herman van Rompuy, at that time president of the European Council. And last but not least, you are renowned for all your books and writings. So a warm welcome and welcome back, because you were here for the 50th anniversary of the Danish membership of the EU. So you love anniversaries, apparently. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you to our other hosts for this nice occasion to add a few thoughts and comments to an already very rich day here in Copenhagen. And indeed, it was not far away from here, at another venue, that some of us discussed the 50 years of Denmark's own accession, which is interesting because Denmark is, of course, with Ireland and the UK, the very first European state to have actually joined the Den community. So you know the process, both as an applicant and as a union member, and this may explain, beyond the coincidences of the EU presidency calendars back in '93 and '02, but this may explain why Denmark and people like my good friend here on the first row, Paul Skeeter Christoffersen and many others, have such a good political nose for the enlargement dynamics. You know both sides. Now, as you said, in this final session, we turn the perspective around from the candidates to the Union. What does the Union need to do itself? How should it change? What is most urgent? Is it feasible? Etc. It's interesting that this debate has been gaining traction in the past weeks, in fact, rightly so, I think. It is vital, and it will stay with us probably for years. Now, in my talk, the 15 minutes, rather than diving straight into the policy issues like CAP reform, I should like to first set the scene with 2 general considerations. By looking at today's moment as a new 1989, which we've already been discussing, and also, secondly, by examining this notion of absorption capacity. Now, on the first point, obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has altered the European continent in a way no other single event has done since 1989 and the end of the Cold War. Now, just as back then, the states of Europe set out to reorganize the continent's political order, German reunification, 1990, Warsaw Pact, dissolved.
It's God calling.
No, I hope it's not already the end of my speech. I'm waiting for that clock of you, which is ticking later in the day. NATO started expanding, and also the 12 states of the European community reshaped their club into today's union in Maastricht. And this moment was, of course, followed 2 years later by the Copenhagen moment we celebrate here today, when the EU offered accession to most Central and Eastern European states, which ended after the preparations which the 3P panel this morning talked about, with symbolically at least with this 2004 Big Bang enlargement. Now, I think it's probably also the sense here in the room that the geopolitical shock of 2022 requires a similar strategic response as a new 1989. Russia's invasion was a trigger, and within days, President Zelensky sent his application letter, his country's application letter, which in turn reactivated the Western Balkans process. And I tend to agree also with the gentleman from the mission of Turkey, briefly the prospects of Turkey, at least until the elections. The European Council answered to that response of the moment in June 2022, 1 year ago, by granting Ukraine and Moldova EU candidate states and offering Georgia, we've discussed all this, a European perspective. 1 year ago, so in a way, finally, it's a good moment also for the European Union to start looking at itself and what it means to get ready for of going up to perhaps 36 members. So that's the history-driven, strategic context of it. And that brings us to my second general point of absorption capacity. Criterion, also invented by the 1993 Copenhagen European Council, on that famous page 13, which you read out loud this morning, Luke. But this criterion has never been defined, and therefore it remains highly political, if not contested. And with the advantage of 30 years of hindsight, it's an advantage, huh? Commemorating, celebrating, but it also gives more view. There is a striking asymmetry in how each side, outside and inside the Union, must do its homework. There's an imbalance there. Whereas for candidate countries, there are procedures, criteria, this merit-based process we discussed today. All that exists. But for the Union, for the Union's internal reforms, no such processes are in place. There's nothing. And this means that for the upcoming accessions, these processes and so on will have to be shaped and planned almost from scratch. There's no guidance here, no boxes to tick, etc. And here we touch upon an ambivalence in this notion of absorption capacity. Because if you think of it, the word has a kind of pseudo-scientific ring to it, huh? As if we could objectively measure it, the way how much water a sponge can absorb. But it is not at all such a measurable thing, absorption capacity, or what we mean by it. Rather, it is a deeply political notion, even if draped in bureaucratic cloth. A notion by which the Union grants itself the freedom to think about its own interests and the costs and risks of enlargement, not to put it off, but to take certain elements into account. Now, unsurprisingly, the suggestion that the European Union's overall strategic interests do not necessarily always coincide with those of the candidates can also encounter some hesitation and resistance, and I presume also in this room, and that's why it's good to have a debate. Last time this debate raged about absorption capacity was in 2006-07, I remember at least, and then it was around Turkey. One EU analyst favoring the country's entry considered absorption capacity, and here I quote, a dangerous tool in the hands of those who want to keep out Turkey and stop enlargement altogether. End of quote. On the other hand, you could also say that any political body needs the capacity to gauge its vital interests and, when you're talking about enlargement, to reflect about its borders, its territorial scope, in order to adapt to change in the stream of events. Now, that was just two preliminary comments on the strategic context and absorption notion, and now I want to look briefly at four key topics, which no doubt we'll also discuss in the panel, illustrating some of these fundamental issues for the Union. And I'm going to give them away: institutions, budget, single market, and security. Now, first on decision-making and institutions. Any increase in the number of member states alters the Union's institutional and political dynamics. That's the fact of every enlargement in the past. It will also be the case now. It will impact the relations, all relationships at the core of EU decision-making between the Union and its members, between bigger and smaller countries, and also among EU institutions, the power balance will shift. Now, these debates are pretty familiar at EU circles. It's always about vetoes and presidents and seats, and they will be taken up, but they're maybe not as important as some other debates. Now, still on the institutions, I think every single EU government will make its own calculus on these matters. Fair enough. Huh? But in my view, their shared responsibility is to consider whether today's union will remain governable. Governable when it will have up to 36 members, and if not, what reforms then should be envisaged. Only then, ladies and gentlemen, comes the secondary question of whether such reforms would require treaty change or not. It's a secondary question. And we know, of course, since Lisbon, and others have said it also, the EU has withstood a series of major shocks, Euro crisis, a pandemic, Brexit, with the same institutional setup. And in those circumstances, it was favored to rather avoid the obstacle of 27 EU treaty ratifications. If you look at it legally, others may disagree, but the Lisbon Treaty, in fact, can deal with future enlargements, and it also offers paths to institutional reforms on some of the topics which are most discussed, like the Commission's composition, Parliament's seat, and vetoes. But of course, there's also a political case to be made for certain treaty changes to preserve the Union's capacity to act when it is 36, and its ability to protect its interests, perhaps the rule of law as well, post-enlargement. And in any case, my final point on this, even without formal treaty modifications, a significant increase in the EU's membership will result in many informal changes to its governance, decision-making, and power balances. So in that respect, the question is not whether the Union's functioning will change, it will, but whether and how this change is anticipated and embedded. Second issue, more briefly, EU budget. That's clearly in for a change when the Union goes from 27 to 36. On the revenue side, revenues are decided by relative prosperity. It may be the case that many, if not all or almost all, current net recipients could become net contributors. The exact numbers still have to be done, but many of the, let's say, the 2004 incoming member states will be at the other side of the equation next time around. It's a big change. On the expenditure side, it's about the allocation of funds across member states that will change profoundly, and here you have the common agricultural policy and the cohesion policy coming into play. Starting with agriculture, as you know, it's close to 380 billion euros for the 7-year current budget period until 27, which is about 31% of the budget. And as a sign of the scale of the challenge, Ukraine alone has over 40 million hectares of farmland, which is more than the entire territory of Italy. And in Italy, they also have other landscapes beyond farmable land. So that shows the challenge. Now, logically, this means that either the total pie will grow or farmers will each get a smaller slice. And it's a bit the same in the Union's cohesion policy, which is also around 30% of the MFF, which will have to deal with much larger inequalities among states and regions. Because in all of the 9 potential new members, the GDP per capita is less than half of EU average. And since the purpose of this policy is convergence, it requires retargeting. That's logic. And again, either the pie grows or each get a smaller slice. Now, of course, there can be transitions, there can be reforms, there can be trade-offs between policies. All of that can be decided, but in any case, as it was done in the years before 2004, some tough budgetary choices are unavoidable. Thirdly, and briefly, single market. Here too, extending free movement to another 9 countries and up to 70 million more people will create new economic opportunities, enhance trade, improve resilience, which is good for the candidates' neighbors and for trading nations like Denmark. But these welfare gains will not immediately be distributed equally, and there may also be some shocks. And plus, it's not just goods or capital, it's also people. And enlarging the union's space of free movement may fill some gaps on the labor market when people seize opportunities. On the other hand, a downward effect on overall wage levels will not be universally appreciated. I'm putting it diplomatically here. But you could say that the Brexit debate remains, unfortunately, a stark reminder of how highly political these issues can become. Now, how to go about it? Traditionally, acceding to the single market has been seen as an all-or-nothing decision. Now, a more promising approach, as recently advocated by Commission President von der Leyen, could be sectoral integration. That is, this would allow candidate countries to gain access to the single market progressively, so not in one fell swoop at the end of a lengthy and uncertain process, but step by step. And I think this is something worth exploring. A fourth and final field, dear Chair, where going from 27 to 36 will make a big difference, is on the map, strategically and geographically. The enlarged Union will have new external borders. It may harbor more diverse strategic interests. Its territorial center of gravity will shift further eastward, away from the Atlantic, towards the Black Sea. At the same time, a reliance on the United States for security is likely to increase, which is more, if you want, a kind of westward movement. Now, obviously, the major strategic change will be Ukraine's entry, with all respect for the other 8 candidates we're talking here about. Starting accession negotiations with a country at war is one thing, which probably will and should be done. Concluding them poses major difficulties and hard questions. Because, as you know, unlike NATO, with its Article 5, the EU is currently unable to offer Ukraine sufficient military support to uphold our own mutual defense commitment, which is embedded in Article 42.7. After 1989, all EU entrant states, which were formerly in the Soviet sphere, so not counting Austria and Sweden and Finland, all the others first joined the Atlantic Alliance before joining the EU, sometimes weeks or months or years, but always earlier, for a reason. And here I just simply say that ahead of the Vilnius summit, which we discussed, these strategic linkages between NATO and EU membership need to be kept in mind. Now, to quickly conclude, focusing on one aspect, which I know is dear to the director of think tank Europa, so I'm hoping on her tolerance here, which is public opinion. Enlargement is not only a matter of political will of the accession countries, and it's not only a matter of hard policy and reform work in the acceding countries and for the EU. Ultimately, it also needs the democratic support of 27 EU member publics. Going a final time back to 1989, back then, people in Western Europe, citizens in Western Europe, rediscovered, in a way, let's be frank, and I was on that side of the border, West Europeans rediscovered they had neighbors sharing the same continent to the east, behind the Iron Curtain. This realization did not come always without tensions and misunderstandings. But ultimately, the promise of 1993, the Copenhagen summit, the united continent, was upheld and voted by majorities across the Union. And today, we face a similar historic imperative. However, in the years ahead, public debates around enlargement are unlikely to be easier than in the previous round. And even without a full treaty reform, other accession-related decisions will need to be solemnly ratified by 27 national parliaments or via referendum, which may be politically unavoidable in certain member states. And my guess is that the public at large, be it in Denmark, in France, in Portugal, or Croatia, would quite sensibly expect their political leaders to have drawn some lessons from recent experience and to look ahead. Now, I don't really mind whether you call this improving absorption capacity or simply an exercise in political responsibility, but this is ultimately about making sure the Union itself is ready for this big change. It's a tall order, but as Minister Rasmussen said, history is calling. So good we talk about it and that we can get started. Looking forward to the panel. Thank you.
Excellent. And now it's not history calling, but me calling, sort of. For my panel, please to join me up here. And if some thought that I'd fallen asleep or that I was not as sort of cruel to you as to all the other speakers, it is because I decided that your sort of intervention was far more brilliant than my own one, sort of. So you basically got my 15 minutes of conclusions. So just to clarify that we will end this conference on time, 5:15, but I may just use 1-2 minutes in saying thank you and so forth. Okay. I think basically what I would like to also focus on before I give the floor to our speakers, the rest of the panel, is something I cannot get my head around. I mean, we have spoken at this conference a lot about that speed is important. So history is calling, we should make sure that these candidate countries join as soon as possible, because we cannot have gray zones anymore, so we need to have green light, I think was one of the expressions used. Okay, at the same time we hear that one should not lower the bar. The Copenhagen Criteria are still sort of extremely relevant, and we should implement them again, we shouldn't change them. Am I the only one thinking that it's going to be difficult, that one will have to square a circle here? Luke also mentioned the fact about, well, can we actually enlarge without undermining support for the present European Union? That was also one of the arguments I used at the beginning of this conference, reminding us all that enlargement was actually one of the reasons why there was a no to the constitutional treaty in France and also in the Netherlands, and it was also linked to Brexit. So these two sort of contradictions, if you like to call it, or dilemma, I'd like sort of to ask you about. But obviously, we should start with what you think is the most important issue that I'd like to talk about. So I'll start with the Director for the European Union at the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs in France. You have earlier been posted to locations as different as Iran, Armenia, and Sweden. And please pronounce your name, so I don't make a mistake. David, I can say that at least.
Yeah, I need the microphone to work for this.
Absolutely.
The Czech ambassador, if he's still here, he could do it. It's pronounced Cvach. It's a Czech origin, although I was born in Paris. So now I'm in trouble because I want to be polite and reply to your questions, and at the same time I have some things that I wanted to say.
I said you can respond later.
I will try to elegantly or not combine the two. Maybe starting with an uncharacteristic assertion from a French official. We have no plan for this. There is usually a French plan for everything, but not really yet for how we deal with this enlargement and the EU reform that must go with it. But maybe we have a few guiding principles. And the first one is that we want this to happen and we want this to work. There have been a number of quotes earlier during the day of French President François Mitterrand in particular, showing that France was a reluctant enlarger. And that's a feeling I still can detect when I travel across Europe. And yet, we were very proud exactly a year ago when at the end of the French presidency we gave candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova. And a month ago our president had a big speech in Bratislava on his way to Chisinau, where I think it was clear that he was very engaged in this discussion and very open to this prospect. And so why is that? I would say there are two big factors playing in our thinking. The first one, Luc talked about it. It's of course the let's say the geopolitics, the seismic event. And so February 24 of last year changes the equation. And on that day, we felt we'd much rather deal with the challenges of enlarging than the challenges of not enlarging. Because after the war in Ukraine started, not enlarging becomes, in the very real sense, dangerous. So it changes the strategic calculation, let's say. The second element, traditionally France, it is true, fears enlargement, fears the diluting dimension of enlargement. We just feel that the more we are, the less we are likely to go far, right? And so traditionally, we always wanted to deepen the project, the political project, before we would enlarge. I'm not sure we really succeeded in that, looking back, but that's how we've looked at all previous enlargements. But this one, I would argue, takes place in a context where we have been deepening the European Union over the last few years, quite significantly, not through treaty reform, outside of treaties, but the response to COVID, what we are doing in this war, that's a deepening, and I would say a considerable deepening of EU integration of sorts. We are doing a number of things that I'm not sure we would even agree on today if we were negotiating them in a treaty reform. And I remember vividly some discussions we had about the European Peace Facility before the war broke out. We are clearly in a different world. I mean, the notion that we would use essentially all this money to provide weapons to Ukraine at the time would have seemed ludicrous. So it's a different context and therefore a different French vision. Maybe I could insist on two items, building on what I just said. If we're doing this for strategic reasons, then it would make sense to think about some kind of strategic, the 27, the candidate countries, and us together. By that I mean hard security, of course. We have this very new challenge of potentially enlarging to countries who would not have previously enlarged to NATO. That's new. And the issue of the security guarantees that we can provide to Ukraine is an issue that we are debating just now. It will be on the table of the European Council later this week. But I mean also not so hard security, but critical issues of reducing dependencies. That has been one of the big issues where the EU has moved over recent years. We've realized the depth of our critical dependency across a wide spectrum of issues. We are hard at work reducing them. It seems to me if we are going to enlarge, we cannot have dependencies come back through the window, just as we are trying to reduce them amongst 27. So I'm not, I don't think Ukraine will have much dependency from Russia, but we really need to think of how this enlargement improves our ability to be autonomous where we need to be, including from China and other players. The second issue, and that's revolving around the Copenhagen criteria. Of course, we need to think about all the kind of rules of procedures that will allow us to function better. But I would say that we also need for this enlargement, particularly, to have a clearer vision of what we mean by European values. And I was struck listening today to the panelists, particularly those from the candidate countries. This notion of European values seems to be clearer in their mind than it is in the minds of many member states. And I'm struck in the discussions we have with some member states that they have a very, very clear vision of European values and they feel they are actually fighting for them. It's just completely different from what we put under European values. And I think this is the time probably to address this issue and not circumvent it. I will not pretend I can define them all by myself, but I would say I would see three elements, and I will end with this. Three sets of elements. One is the fact that since the basis for the Union is that we have a free and level market, anything revolving around discrimination or corruption cannot be. And we have to have very strict legal guarantees that it doesn't happen. It's the case, probably can make even more progress there. The second element is that it should be agreed that territorial disputes, historical grievances, and I think there are still many within the EU, but also in the candidate countries, those must be solved in a peaceful way. And we can do anything we want on qualified majority and so on. If we've seen even recently how such historical controversies can really harm the decisions among 27. And the third element is solidarity. And solidarity, I think, if we've learned something with the war in Ukraine and before that with COVID, that solidarity between us, it's not just the fact that we share a common market. It's the fact that we bought vaccines together. It's the fact that we are purchasing weapons together. It's the fact that we agreed to borrow together to bounce back from the COVID crisis. It means we help each other when we have forest fires. It means we help each other when we have our nationals stranded in Sudan or elsewhere. And so that's an element that we would like to bring to the debate. And to conclude, we feel we have to emerge from this historic enlargement. The EU has to emerge as a much tougher animal when it comes to dealing with the outside world, but as a much, I would say, kinder in a way, gentler, and more solidary animal when it comes to the relations within the European Union.
The last part sounded like the Billy Ocean principle. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. We move on now to Jean de Rooij. You used to be the permanent representative of Belgium to the European Union, so you were a colleague to Poul Skytte Christoffersen, so lucky you. You have then also been advisor to Catherine Ashton. I don't know whether it was the same time as Poul, but doesn't matter in this context. Today you are using your wide knowledge from the diplomatic servants as a consultant for the Copenhagen and Berlin group. Welcome to Copenhagen, and since you worked at Catherine Ashton's sort of World Department, QMV, so far we've heard maybe it isn't that important. What's your point of view? And thank you so much for coming.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here because I was in Copenhagen 30 years ago in this famous European Council.
So you remember, hopefully.
And I must say this European Council, that has not been mentioned often, but was also the end of the process of ratification of the Maastricht Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
So
that was the first line.
There was big euphoria. In fact, not so much because of the enlargement criteria, because that was the enlargement criteria were a sort of indication that we finally had accepted the political challenge to enlarge towards the east of Europe. It was a very difficult political decision. Ask Putin what he thinks about it. It was a very positive atmosphere in the EU at the time. So this last criterion you asked me about, the Union's capacity to absorb, as you said, and what was repeated in 2022, it's in the text of the European Council of 2022, there is absorption concept, but also while maintaining the momentum of EU integration. And that's obviously a bigger problem, because this momentum is not very high for the moment. We heard our colleagues from the Balkan countries this morning. I agree very much with the Minister of North Macedonia when he said, okay, we have lost the perspective, and our people do not believe in it anymore as they did in the beginning. So we had this 12 years now since the accession of Croatia. We had this fatigue of the enlargement. And then suddenly last year everything changed. Why did everything change? Why suddenly not only Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova are now considered as potential members of the EU, but also this dynamic, I think, of the Balkan, for the Balkan countries has been revived. Why? Why is it? Because precisely the issue is no longer seen as, well, I would say from a bureaucratic point of view, by its weaknesses and by its challenges for the functioning of the EU. Suddenly it has been decided, we get back to what was from the first day, in fact, even from the first day of the Union, the basic meaning for the Union. It is not to 6 countries which then wanted an imperialistic démarche. No, this démarche of enlargement of the EU is as objective to stabilize the continent. Remember, after the end of the Cold War, we said, I remember Manfred Wörner at the time said, we have to project stability from the west to the east. Okay, and 1 year ago, this stability has been challenged seriously, very seriously. First war on the EU territory. Nobody expected that. So we had to have a very strong reaction. So suddenly, all this issue of enlargement has become again a major geopolitical challenge. And that's why we are committed, we said it very clearly, we are committed to have all these countries accede, obviously, if they respect the criteria of Copenhagen. So we are there now. The problem is, obviously, that it's a big challenge for you, as Luc, as you said. The problem that we have also for the moment is that the EU is not like when the 10 acceded at that time. It was euphoria again. It was the turn of the century. The euro has been created. We believed that everything was fine. Nobody thought that you would have a financial crisis a few years after. So we did that in a period of now. The problem for the EU, as for other countries, other parts of the world, is economic crisis. We have an economic crisis, very serious, and it's clear that public opinion in our countries is not prepared for treaty change. You have a proposal by the European Parliament. You had the result of the conference on the future of Europe, which is obviously, and my country, Belgium, has always been very much in favor of institutional progress. But we have to be realistic. We cannot do it in the current context. So no treaty change which would, by change of treaty, bring more majority voting. Majority voting, in fact, is already going very far, except in foreign policy, as you know, and in taxation issues. But so we have to be clear. Maybe one day, maybe everything will be fine again in a few years, but not in the years to come. I think it would be a wrong démarche to even try to launch a process which will only create dramas in the member states. But this said, I think, and I'm not a pessimistic by nature, I think a lot can be done just by the acquis communautaire that we have and which can be used to its maximum. I'm optimistic because you saw what the Commission was able to do with the COVID pandemic and selling vaccines all over the world. You see what we are doing with climate change. The European Union is at the forefront of the reaction to climate change, but also by using tools which nobody expected at the time that we could use, like the borrowing money. So I think we can do a lot, certainly in the negotiation with these countries to make progress. It's clear that a union at 35 with countries which are not on the rich side of the union creates a lot of problems. It has been mentioned several times today that in the next financial discussion on the new financial
MFF,
framework, this will have to be taken into account. But we have this framework, we have this discussion. We don't need to change the treaty to do that. What makes me a little optimistic also is that there is a lot of respect for the European Union. In fact, the European Union is popular. The von der Leyen Commission, for me, is probably the most popular commission since Jacques Delors. So this is good. And so we can count on our institution. People trust our institution. And anyway, I think the reaction of public opinion in general to the war in Russia makes that public opinion in general will certainly support it. So I will not enter in the details of treaty change, but you can do a lot without changing the treaty with we have the Passerelle formula, you have, in fact, we discussed changing the treaty since the Maastricht Treaty was launched. Obviously, when we negotiate the accession, we can see long transition periods also. So you have the treaty, but then the countries have to wait. So all these tools exist, and I think we should concentrate on this, but start the process.
So no treaty change even for Belgium. I mean, that's interesting. While you were speaking, I found the document, the most important document that we've been debating today, the Council conclusions, European Council conclusions from Copenhagen, and it completely confirms your point. The European Council welcomed the outcome of the Danish referendum and the prospect of a rapid completion of the ratification procedures on the Maastricht Treaty in all member states. But that is then also, illustration of absorption capacity, because before Maastricht Treaty could be ratified, then you could not accept the EFTA countries to join, and you couldn't, make the point about promising accession to the candidate countries, so the Copenhagen Criteria. So everything sort of comes in a nice way with that point. We have also there completed the circle, but obviously we've not finished at all with this panel. So let me introduce Nikolai von Ordotza. And as already, I will mention that now, you are head of the Europe Research Division at the German Institute of International and Security Affairs in Berlin. You are at the moment one of 12 members of the French-German or German-French working group of experts on institutional reform. So let's have a sneak preview of what's going to happen in that working group, or, well, maybe not, but let's have your spiel with regards to this particular topic. Over to you.
Yeah, I see whether I'd solve the Copenhagen test of getting the microphone to work, but at the moment
Yes, yes.
Yes.
You
yes,
have
yes,
you
now it's working.
you have graduated.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you also for the impressive timekeeping. Maybe that is one of the answers to the EU's enlargement dilemma. They just hire you,
well.
and you go through the enlargement process, and everything will happen on time. But I wanted to bring three points to the table, and maybe also disagree a little bit with the panel here. First, a general point on enlargement. I think we talked a lot today about EU of 36, 35 countries, and it just sounds you add 9 or 10 or 8 countries to the mix. But I think we really have to think through the gravity of this situation. And if we look at the countries that would join, we would, on the one hand, have the 5th largest country to ever join the EU, with Ukraine, and then many, many small countries from the Western Balkans and Moldova. And I tried to make calculations how that would change the makeup of the seats in the European Parliament, qualified majority voting, and so on, and I stumbled about an interesting fact. Together, Ukraine, Moldova, and the 6 countries of the Western Balkans have about the population size of the United Kingdom, which obviously just left the European Union. But they would have twice the number of seats in the European Parliament, 8 times as many vetoes in all questions of anonymity, and 10% of the UK's GDP. And if we just think that gravity through, then we know that we will have a fundamental task about all the questions that Luke laid out about the institutions, the single market, and so on. And so I think if we make the discussion about absorption capacity today, it's quite the opposite of what the colleague said about Turkey. Today, the discussion about EU reform, absorption capacity is no longer a tool to keep these countries out, but rather, at least from a German point of view, you would say, if we are serious about that enlargement, we have to be serious about the reform debate. We cannot just pretend that the EU doesn't have to change or that we can use a couple of passerelle clauses. We have to talk about a fundamental reform of the EU institutions to make it ready, and this reform needs to happen in parallel with the enlargement process, at least over the time of the next legislative cycle, so that the EU could be ready by 2030 at the earliest to assume new members. And my second point that I want to make about the EU institutions, and we could go into details about the sort of European Parliament seats, the QMV, questions of capacity to act, but I think two points that we haven't talked about today are important for me to add. These institutional debates are always also debates about power and about distribution of power in the EU. And that just means if we think about, for instance, QMV, and we suddenly add 8, 9, or 10 countries, the power distribution in the EU changes. And therefore, we also have to, if we talk about capacity to act, seats in the European Parliament, we have to see how that does it change the power distribution in the EU, and do we want changes? And I think therefore every single country will look to what does happen to my blocking majority. Do we need not only more QMV, but also changes to how QMV is calculated? And my second point on that institutional debate, and that was for me not mentioned enough, it's not only a question of capacity to act, it's also a question of democracy. And it's a question about democracy on the one hand, as Luke said in the end, of how these countries are taken into the EU and how it's ensured that there is the democratic support. But it's also a question that if we deepen the EU along the reform, how do we ensure that the EU remains democratic? Just to give you a simple example, in Olaf Scholz's Prague speech, he called for more QMV and had a sort of implicit package deal in there saying we need more QMV in foreign policy and more QMV in tax matters. Now, foreign policy and tax matters, these are core state powers. These are core state powers where the German Chancellor now said, we are willing to give up our vetoes and we want all other EU member states to do so. And these are questions where I then say, this also touches democratic legitimacy. If countries can, in the future, potentially be outvoted on tax matters in the European Council, we need a much stronger involvement of the European Parliament there, and we also need to think about the whole democratic legitimacy system of the EU in order to enable these questions. And this brings me to my third and final point, where I find myself disagreeing with Belgium here, and this is A rare case, I remember a Belgian diplomat once saying to me in a round that the Belgians are the last ayatollahs of European integration. And here I'm sitting and find myself disagreeing on the question of treaty change. Because I think if we go through the list of the challenges that there are in the different EU institutions and how deep these reforms are, yes, you can try to find a big package where you do a passerelle here, make some changes to the composition of the European Parliament seats there. But if you add all these reform demands together, you reach, in my point of view, a threshold that demands treaty change. And I don't believe that the publics in the European Union would be comfortable with a situation where you would, for instance, move towards QMV in tax matters, where you change the power dynamics in the European Union, if we do that just by hidden integration by stealth. And I think it reaches a point where treaty change is necessary. And the second aspect of that is we've reached a kind of petrification of the EU treaties, where there's a taboo whenever we have a discussion and there's a reform need that demands treaty change. We have countries saying, clear no, we cannot have treaty change. And I think the enlargement debate, where we have, I think, a sort of matrix of countries where there are some pushing strongly for enlargement but are hesitant on EU reform, like maybe Poland. You have some countries which are a little bit more in favor of EU reform but hesitant on enlargement. And then maybe Germany and France both pushing for EU reform and enlargement. I think for me it's the single moment in the foreseeable future where the EU actually has the package and the demand together to put treaty change on the table. And therefore I'm going to be the outlier here in the conference to at least put on the table the question, if the reform needs are so high, do we then not only also have to have a serious conversation about an enlarged EU needs to be a reformed EU, and that reformed EU needs at least part of the debate on what we need to do via treaty change.
We did not coordinate this, but I actually found a quote by Olaf Scholz from his Prague speech. The alternative to majority voting would incidentally not be to hold firm to the status quo. Instead, it would be to move forward in increasingly diverse groups with a jungle of different rules and complicated opt-ins and opt-outs. It would be a confusing tangle, an invitation to all those who want to bet against a united geopolitical Europe and play us off against each other. I don't want that, quote unquote. So that's at least, you could say, part of the debate, that there is also something that could happen if we don't move to majority voting, but that was just to put that also into debate. Luke, do you want to say a few words? You don't have to, because I already had a brilliant intervention, I'm sure, down here by Artis Paprits, but...
No, I think that's better. Apparently I've spoken too long already, so over to the public.
Okay, yeah, the public, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, but thank you for the last comments particularly, and I mean, I will drop now the next 5 cents for this debate. I'm afraid we will not finish at 5 o'clock. But
no, 5. Quarter past 5.
I'm coming from a Northern European country, just like auditorium here, and these are number of smaller countries. Some are richer, some are more poor. Now, once you mentioned that all those accession countries, they would have 8 votes, 10% of the British economy, etc. And obviously, that was with intention to think, which I understand, that if so much power will get countries which are, let's say, youngsters, what will happen to all of us? But we know that the power distribution doesn't leave an empty space. So if we make those reforms you suggested, then who will gain power? The bigger ones? Because once you mentioned 2 issues, which is foreign policy, understandable, and taxation. And now looking from a small country which is trying to run faster than the other countries because we have to reach something. If we look at the foreign policy experience briefly before Russian invasion in Ukraine, what type of foreign policy will be And will this foreign policy will take into account the warnings of small countries, sovereignty of countries which were not, let's say, listened before? What will happen with our transatlantic alliance, which we stand for, and not everybody maybe is so interested in such type of transatlantic alliance. So if we take away the vetoes, I understand maybe decision-making will be easier, but in which favor? And taxation is about the faster running. So to put the same taxation, for instance, in Latvia and Estonia, and France and Spain, how would that influence actually, in general, the economic power distribution and our capabilities ever to reach some kind of higher level? And finally, this is actually not only a question about small, nasty guys who are not so rich as somebody who is big and rich, but this is a question, I mean, how we Europeans actually will compete with US and China economically. I mean, are we capable by all these rules actually to be enough able? Militarily, we already lost, in fact, in many ways. And what will happen economically? Because these guys, they will not think about those values what we stand for. They simply go on and they get richer, stronger, faster, and more aggressive. So how would you manage that?
Well, do you want to have a quick response to that?
So I'm tempted to say I poked the bear, but that would obviously be the wrong image in this respect. So a couple of points. I think that's why I'm saying we need to have a debate about the relationship between small and large member states, East and West, frugals, net payers, and so on, if we think about enlarged EU. My example with the sort of 8 vetoes, 10% of GDP, was not to say that this means that these countries don't deserve a veto, but it means that decision-making in the EU would be exponentially more complicated, and that in every area with anonymity, we would stretch the limit of what becomes still governmental in the EU. From the thinking that I get in Berlin is that there is this willingness to think about this kind of package deal with tax and CFSP, but of course there are still reservations even there. On what kind of tax policy decisions would be given away, what kind of CFSP decisions would be given away. And I think one realization is there also that as these are core state powers, there need to be some sort of sovereignty guarantee in core national interests, so that you have a move towards qualified majority voting in the policy area as a whole, but some kind of security, sovereignty safety net where the most crucial questions, for instance, could be delegated to the European Council, where you have, as the example you would give, Russia policy would certainly be a sort of core national interest. So I think there needs to be a sort of a real negotiation on that, and then an attempt to find a balance between the sort of serious national interest of the member states and the willingness to make an EU of 35 countries work. And then a second point is this fear of losing power in this enlarged European Union, I think is universal to all countries. So also in Berlin, there is this debate about will there be the shift eastwards. If you make the calculation, Germany and France will lose their voting share, and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe together would have more votes than Germany and France. And so if you talk about the European Parliament, and you would stick with the limit of the 751, that would mean primarily the large EU member states would need to give up seats in the European Parliament. So I don't think it's only a question of small countries giving up something, but all EU countries needing to reflect on what new balance can we find in this enlarged European Union, and how can we reinsure that balance that we have amongst 27, 28 in 30, 35. And this is why I think we should put the issues on the table rather than skirt them and say we can do it via passerelle and easy fixes at the margins.
Okay, I'll sort of make another attempt before I then have the 2 questions down here. My contradiction that I mentioned at the beginning, you did not respond to it, maybe it was because it was not particularly wise, but I'll try again. Today we've all agreed, more or less, that we should have enlargement as soon as possible. We've also agreed that we shouldn't lower the bar. I was just wondering, is that really possible? Or should one also consider some kind of staged integration where the candidate countries obviously should become members like the rest of us, but maybe they can already become parts of the European Union as we go along. Maybe they get observer status in the various councils, maybe even the European Council. Don't look so shocked. I mean, you put some things on the table. Shouldn't that also be part of our debate? Because otherwise, I have a fear that, it would seem to take so long with the various rounds of accession that some of them may say, well, this is taking too long. Well, there won't be any public support. We heard that from some of the West Balkan countries. So do think about it. I may get an answer. But I have two questions here. Paul Skytte Christoffersen, and then down here. Paul, wait for the microphone.
First point, I agree with you on,
yes!
on the gradual integration. But of course, it's combined with the fact that you don't get full membership rights until the whole process is finished. And then 3 facts.
That's always good, yeah.
First fact was that this question about what does enlargement mean for the blocking minority and the powers of the small and the powers of the big countries. First fact was that this was a very heated debate when we enlarged with the 3 Nordic countries. I used the same phrase for Austria as Chirac did. Austria was one of Le Petit du Nord. But that was a long debate which prolonged the enlargement negotiations with these 3 countries for 6 months. Then we come to the Danish presidency, and we decided, maybe somewhat courageous, that we didn't want to have a repeat of what had happened with the first enlargement. So why did it become so complicated? Because people were making all kinds of calculations. You add that country, and you have this and that, and the third qualified majority blocking. So what did we do? We circulated an envelope during the council in September with Per Stigmøller in the council. In this envelope for each delegation, we had written the number of European parliamentarians you would get, the numbers of votes you would get, and the qualified majority.
Blocking minority, yeah.
Yes. But they only got their own figures.
Okay.
And then
you got mail, okay.
So they didn't get a tableau which would set out the whole picture. And then Per asked, are there any objections? And the answer was no. That was how this very intractable question was solved in enlargement with 10 new member states. Second fact on own resources. If you look at the own resources, making abstraction of new generation EU, which is an exceptional situation. But if you take the percentage of the GDP, which is covered by own resources, it's less today than it was before the big enlargement. Less today than it was before the big enlargement. Third or fourth.
Third, yeah. Your last point.
Treaty change and qualified majority voting. I do agree that the passerelle will not solve all our problems. For instance, we could never agree on a passerelle on fiscal matters or on taxation. The only opportunity for agreeing on taxation is to have a very clearly defined description of what taxation we are talking about and what kind of decision could go to qualified majority voting. And there I would just let everybody recall what has happened over the past year. We have been doing qualified majority voting on taxation in relation to the electricity reform, to new generation EU, because these provisions, these decisions were taken under the emergency provision of the treaty. Well, if we were sensible people, couldn't we just decide that what we did during this past year we would continue to do? But that would require a small treaty modification, but no, please, convention a la Verhofstadt.
Thank you very much for those 3 facts. And Paul used to be my chairman, so that's why he was allowed to come with those very important points. And I moved not because I now pretend to be Foreign Minister of Denmark or any other minister. I was just having too much sun over there. Now, 5 minutes each on the issues I'd like to respond to. David, do you want to start? Because you seem to be in the starting block there. Oh, sorry, 2 minutes, otherwise we're going to be completely dead here.
Yeah, and also I feel I didn't reply to your question. So we must go fast and we can't go fast, right? That was the question, the dilemma we are in. So yes, I think it's perfectly legitimate to have a debate about staged accession, and then there are all kinds of schemes floating around, and we'll have a lot of fun trying to devise something that works. But I would point out that it's already kind of happening. I mean, Ukraine is in the has access roaming, access to the markets. That has created some difficulties when it comes to cereals, but it's already a considerable connection to the EU. What we are doing in terms of security and defense is also unprecedented. And I would use this opportunity to mention the European political community, which I noticed has been mentioned a couple of times as an interesting forum, not to oversell it, but not to underappreciate it. As an interesting, I think the term that was used was a way of socializing, which I think is interesting, and I think there is a bit more potential there.
But not Tinder, I presume.
Within. We'll see how far it goes.
Okay, sorry.
And we have interesting prospects ahead of us with the meetings in Spain, and I would say very interestingly in London next year. Maybe a very quick note on treaty change. I mean, it's probably a good time to break taboos. So we are open to qualified majority in taxation, which is traditional for France. We are also open to it in foreign policy, which is a bit less traditional. But to be honest, we don't think that this is by any means the biggest problem we have ahead of us. I mean, we could move to qualified majority in those 2 areas, and that would be a minimal step compared to the magnitude of the challenge. And I think the key for us, if we envisage a European Union with 35 or plus countries, is where do you keep an ability to really move forward? And for us, French and German, that's a real question. I think the French-German engine, so to say, it's already a while that it's not enough to pull the others. It remains the indispensable basis, I think. If you don't have that agreement, you don't go anywhere. But if you do have that agreement, it's already not the case today that it's enough. You need to pull in other players. And I think it's a challenge for our countries, but I think we're trying to do it, to develop other key relationships with the countries within the EU or group of countries within the EU, to be able not to create that's your quote of Chancellor Scholz, diverse groups and
jungle,
jumble, but to have enough countries that are committed, and that could include actually countries that are currently candidates, that are really committed to the project, and that we can make proposals to others, and we can move forward together.
Luke, your final 2 minutes.
Thank you. No, a lot of good and interesting things have been said. I already mentioned on your overall question, I fully agree with David that indeed there's a tension between these two things of we want to move quickly and we have to be able to do so, and faced with that tension, something will have to move, and you get sometimes transitions, you get perhaps also new formats could be one outcome, but I think the appetite of this really depends depending on who you talk to, and I think some candidate countries which have been in that position for a very long time, they would more easily agree to get out of an all or nothing approach, because then in the end it may last a very long time or be nothing. Whereas for a country like Ukraine, for instance, or perhaps also Moldova, anything which would not be full membership immediately would feel as a disappointment, if not a betrayal. So the openness to think more out of the box is not the same within the EU on the one hand, nor among the candidate countries. So there's also the politics of even having that debate. I also agree with David's second point that we very easily get drawn into these fascinating institutional debates, and Nicolai and I will have to do that at some other time or over a beer, and all these different dimensions. There's no time for this here, although I do think it's also really, there are really no answers there on what democracy then is, and there's also no easy answer on how to convince public opinions to go along with it. But the real challenges are probably not there on the institutional front, but on really, and I think that's one of the points I wanted to make up there, is it will really be a different European Union in many aspects, and I think we're only starting to grapple with the magnitude of that, and there will be a lot of work, and it has to be done.
Many more conferences, I presume. Nicolai, your last point?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Two points. First, on will it go fast or not? I think, in fact, the issue is very different.
It's not red.
Yeah. The issue of the timing is very different now than it was at with the big enlargement with Poland. I was ambassador in Poland from '94, and so immediately after the at that time, Poland was very much still a communist country with all the system. So it took time only to adapt. Ukraine is already very much evolved. They have adapted a lot to the European way of conducting economic relations. So I think they will have obviously problems, but they are already prepared culturally for accession. In fact, the comprehensive agreement with Ukraine that we concluded 10 years ago is going rather far. So the problem will be more a problem of adaptation to for all adaptation. And I said that the solution will probably be long transition period in agriculture, the time we reform the common agricultural policy. That's one thing. QMV, I am very much personally in favor of changing
You look already very excited,
treaty.
yeah.
And I was so pleased. I was already part of the Single European Act in
okay,
the 80s. Yeah. I wrote a book of the Single European, because we changed, we allowed the internal market to develop. The problem I say is, is in the current context, in the current economic situation, in the current way East and West of Europe look at each other, it would be foolish to submit a new treaty to the national parliament.
Which is a cue to you, Nicola, and you have 1 minute.
Okay,
otherwise I'll be fired.
I just wanted to respond on 2 points. On that dilemma, I think we really need to be real in the time frame. So there was an interesting calculation from a think tank in Belgrade who tried to extrapolate when the countries of the Western Balkans would join the EU if the current tempo would be kept up. And their result was between 2080 and 2115. And just that goes to show
we won't be there at that time.
That we all probably wouldn't be there. And none of the politicians in power would be there. And so I think we need to set a more realistic timeline that pushes the EU and the countries to move forward first. And we also need to involve much more transitionary elements. So I think if we look at least from Germany, I think the transitionary elements for labor mobility, for instance, helped sell enlargement in Germany. And it was to the detriment of the Brits very much in the Brexit referendum. And I think even Poland might this time introduce transitionary measures for Ukrainian grain, Ukrainian workers, and so on. And so I think stage accession is something, but even after membership, we need to think about a longer transition phase so that we can move the date of enlargement further to the realistic time frame, but know that there is a longer path of integration ahead, even within the EU when these countries join.
Excellent. With these remarks, the conference ends. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, all participants, also those following us online, and also a big thank you to the team at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who worked very hard, and also to my own team, obviously, at Think Tank Europa. So stay tuned. We will return, and before the years that you mentioned, we'll continue the debate also on stage integration, whether we need sort of more qualified majority, and particularly also the public opinion that was also mentioned. So thank you very much for today, and see you soon.